This is the screencast for Chapter 3. You can see the list of activities and lessons that are part of this chapter. Here are the main current Massachusetts standards that are covered in this chapter. The first lesson is called Strange Encounters. The cards on the left are from the copy masters. There's a few more of them. You'll hand them out to students so that they have different cards. They're watching a short video and looking for the answer to their question as they watch the video, and then they'll participate in a class discussion. In the second part, they read a story called What Is It? About a girl who finds an object and is trying to decide whether it's alive or not. They will finish the story with some guiding questions, and this is all to give you some formative assessment information about their current understanding of what it means for something to be alive. Which leads right into the next activity. In the first part of the next activity, in groups, students create a list of characteristics that they think all living things share, and one that they think would be easiest to look for on Mars. In the second half, they use an essay in the book called Describing Life, an Impossible Challenge, to read about the 6 unifying principles, which are the characteristics of life. This is how the curriculum in the book organizes them, and you could see them below, and it's how the overview described them. So these are the characteristics students are expected to know that all living things would exhibit. Leading into the next activity, a look at diversity, which is a jigsaw, and you will assign each jigsaw group a different unifying principle. They will study what that unifying principle is all about, going back to that other reading in the book. Then they'll watch a video, and as they watch the video about the different kingdoms, they're looking to see how each kingdom exhibits that unifying principle. And then they'll go back to their home teams and share out. A couple challenges with this. It is hard to see some of the principles in some kingdoms, especially some of the bacteria and the protists. So you may want to provide additional resources for them to fill in their charts, like readings or computers or iPads. Also, just a note that this activity does use the old 5 kingdom system, and newer standards will cover the 3 domains in the archaea and eubacteria, so you may want to incorporate that into the lesson. I give students this chart or put it on the board for them to create in their notebooks where they can keep track as they watch the video, and then when they're listening to the presentations from the other members of their home team, they can record the information here. At the end, there's also a little graphic organizer to go back to the reading about the 5 kingdoms where they can see these important characteristics of each kingdom, which ones are exhibited among the different kingdoms, which are distinctive, which might be shared. An important note here, there's a big emphasis on the eukaryotic versus prokaryotic cells. That comes up for the first time here, and is important throughout biology. There's also a further challenge with this activity if you look in the book, and it's one I would strongly encourage you to do because it's really where it covers viruses and how viruses are similar to and different from living things. So I have turned it here into a little mini CER. It's not a big multi-day one. It's just for students to get some practice and to learn what a virus is and whether or not scientists consider them living things. The next activity, which is Adaptation, Diversity, and Evolution, has 2 parts. In part A, students watch a video about different oceanic life zones along the rocky shore. They get a map of the different zones with some characteristics, as well as a packet that has different organisms and descriptions of those organisms. As they watch the video, they describe each habitat, each of the different zones, organisms that live there, and then have to pick out adaptations that the organisms have that help them survive there. So making sure that students really understand what an adaptation is. In the second part of the activity, Diversity and Adaptation Across Time, students explore plants and the evolution of plants over time. The way the book writes it, you would actually bring in different plant samples and they would create slides and look at it under the microscope. If you don't have actual plant samples, you can show photos, but it's important to have them big, and then also some zoomed in photos of cells and things like that they can see. After looking at how different plants have evolved over time, they're asked to create a diagram that represents that. From there, they're asked to look at an evolutionary tree in the textbook which they will need some help interpreting and understanding how it works, so that you could then have them do the same thing for plants. There's a reading called From Cell to Seed in the textbook, which has information about how plants evolved over time and the different adaptations that they evolved, and then they could fill in a similar tree like this one, and this is really where evolutionary trees are covered in the curriculum. So you would want to make sure to highlight that and that they can read and understand how these work. The next activity is about the classification system. So part A is just getting them thinking about classification and hierarchical groups, which can be a challenging concept. So you can bring in candy, different hardware, nails, screws, things like that, and have them sorted. I've used fingerprints, pictures, or sneakers that they sort, and then other groups have to figure out what their system was. Part B is the biological classification. And this is an activity where they have these cards with different birds and information. They try to sort them into smaller and smaller groups based on the characteristics that they are given. So here's an example of what the cards look like. Each pair gets a set of cards that they are sorting, and then they would combine it with their neighbors. Here's a diagram I created. I find the one that comes with the teacher resource materials a little bit confusing. So here's one that I recreated. For the higher levels, they are getting the terms from a diagram in the textbook. Once you get down to the family level, they'll just be using the characteristics that they read about the birds to give the sort of title or name to the grouping. The next activity is explaining the zebra stripes. Again, this has two parts. Part A is really looking at the idea of species, whether they know what a species is from a biological perspective. They have pictures, a map, a slideshow, and then a table about 4 different types of zebras, and they have to decide whether they are all different species or how many species there are. I have them actually create a group CERR on Chart People, and then you can have them do a gallery walk and critique each other's CERs as a nice little practice for that as well. In Part B, they're using this idea of zebras again for a different concept, this time looking at explanations for adaptations and really emphasizing the idea of evidence in scientific explanations. So they're given 2 different explanations. They have to read them and decide which one is the best one for why zebras have stripes. And as I mentioned here, I have them sort of underline evidence, inference, and guess in 3 different colored pencils or highlighters to, again, emphasize this idea of evidence in science. Finally, the last thing is the first encounter with the critter. The critter is a project that will follow students throughout the entire year and the entire curriculum, so it's important they have a good foundation. As you can see in every unit, they add on to their critter project. Here's some sample work. They draw their habitat. They have to describe the habitat. They also draw a picture of their critter and label it. And they have to talk about how their critter evolved from other species, and also not from others, from an ancestor, and then also different adaptations and how they're useful to the critter. Here's the rubric that I have used, adapted from the one that comes with the curriculum. Some challenges are that students often try to create hybrids. It's important to really try to head that off from the beginning, that they not do that. I suggest that they take an existing critter and then try to make it even better by giving it more adaptations, making sure they include sufficient detail. Another thing is that it asks them to go back and talk about natural selection from chapter 2. And so students often, if it's been a little while, they start talking about hybridization again. I would suggest actually introducing the critter project in chapter 2 and having them do some of those parts on natural selection while you're still in chapter 2, and then adding on the parts that come from chapter 3 when you get to chapter 3. Providing examples is also very helpful to students. And so here's, again, the student learning outcomes. And you can see the main assessment here is the critter project.